400 amazing, mind-bending facts. A day on Venus is longer than a year. Sharks appeared before trees, and Cleopatra lived closer in time to the moon landing than to the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Antarctica is the largest desert on the planet, even though almost all of it is covered in ice. Lightning can heat the air to a temperature several times hotter than the surface of the sun. Every year, the moon moves about 3.8 centimeters farther away from Earth. An octopus has 3 hearts, and its blood is blue because of hemocyanin, a copper-containing protein. Wombats produce droppings that are almost cube-shaped. Botanically speaking, a banana is a berry, while a strawberry is not. Tyrannosaurus rex lived closer in time to modern humans than to Stegosaurus. Oxford University began teaching several centuries before the Aztec Empire arose. In hot weather, the Eiffel Tower becomes about 15 centimeters taller because of the thermal expansion of metal. Most of Earth's volcanic activity takes place not on land, but underwater. The largest known living organism is not a whale or a sequoia, but the mycelium of a honey fungus covering several square kilometers. And finally, an ordinary deck of 52 cards has more possible arrangements than the number of seconds that have passed since the universe began. All these facts sound made up, as if they were invented simply to astonish people. Yet every one of them is supported by scientific observations, experiments, or historical evidence. The problem is that the brain does not compare something new with all of reality. It has no such database. It compares what it hears with a narrow set of familiar situations. And when a fact falls outside that set, an instant feeling arises. This cannot be true. But a feeling of implausibility is not proof of an error. This is where the main conflict begins. How can we distinguish a genuinely amazing fact from a beautifully told falsehood when, to the ear, they can sound exactly the same? Before we begin exploring this question, subscribe to the channel so you do not lose it. Interesting videos that help you fall asleep are released here regularly. Let's begin. We have already seen that the phrase, "this cannot be true," often says more about the limits of our experience than about the fact itself. Now we need to understand exactly where those limits lie. People are fairly good at estimating the distance to a door, the weight of a bag, or the speed of an approaching car. But change the scale, and intuition begins to make systematic mistakes. If the side of a square is doubled, its area increases not twofold, but fourfold. With a cube, the effect is even stronger. Doubling the side increases the surface area fourfold and the volume eightfold. If the length grows by a factor of 10, the volume becomes 1,000 times greater. This is not abstract geometry. If an animal is enlarged without changing its proportions, its mass grows faster than the cross-sectional area of its bones. That is why an elephant cannot be regarded as simply a large mouse. For the same reason, small animals lose heat faster. Relative to their mass, they have a larger body surface area. Large organisms, by contrast, cool more slowly. A drop of water means almost nothing to us, but for an insect, surface tension can be a major physical force. A water strider stays on the surface not because the water has become denser, but because weight and the forces at the liquid boundary relate differently at that scale. Pollen suspended in water visibly takes part in Brownian motion. Molecules push it around even though the eye cannot see the individual collisions. A small insect can survive a fall that would be fatal to a human because low mass and strong air resistance change the consequences of impact. We handle quantities no better. 1 million seconds is about 11.5 days. 1 billion seconds is almost 32 years. The difference seems simple, only 3 extra zeros. In real time, however, a substantial part of a human lifetime fits between them. 1 millimeter of rainfall looks insignificant, yet over 1 square meter it is already 1 liter of water. Over a hectare it is 10,000 liters. 1 gram per day becomes 365 grams over a year. A loss of only 0.01% from a large production volume can mean tons of material. Accumulation is generally difficult to feel in the moment. A clock that gains only 1 second a day will be more than 6 minutes fast after a year. A faucet dripping once per second can waste several liters of water in a day. The exact amount depends on the size of the drop. Interest that is repeatedly added to an already increased sum creates compound interest. Growth stops being linear, even though it is barely noticeable at first. Some quantities are distorted especially strongly by everyday language. An increase in probability from 1% to 2 is only 1 percentage point, but the relative risk has doubled. An average does not necessarily describe the majority. A few very large values can raise it considerably. In such a situation, the median often describes the typical case more accurately. Scales, too, are not always arranged the way they sound. The acidity scale is logarithmic. A solution whose pH differs by 1 unit has a 10-fold difference in hydrogen ion concentration. Decibels do not combine according to everyday arithmetic either. An earthquake 1 magnitude unit higher has roughly 10 times the oscillation amplitude and releases far more energy. Even temperature measurements can mislead our senses. Metal and wood in the same room are at practically the same temperature, but metal feels colder because it draws heat away from the skin faster. Water at room temperature feels cooler than air at the same temperature for the same reason. Wind increases heat loss from the body, even though a thermometer may show no drop in air temperature at all. Our vision also works comparatively rather than absolutely. The same gray patch looks lighter against a dark background and darker against a light one. Two equal line segments can appear different because of the direction of the surrounding lines. A rare event feels common if it is vivid and easy to remember. And a sample of 10 people may randomly show something that will not appear in a sample of 10,000. That is why common sense is not a universal measuring instrument. It evolved for a middle-sized world. Visible objects, short intervals, and immediate consequences. When scale, accumulation, or the method of measurement changes, the familiar picture falls apart. If we fail to account for this, an error can look more convincing than a fact. But errors of scale are only the first layer of the problem. There is a deeper one. Even when a physical signal is directly in front of us, we do not perceive the signal itself. The eyes do not deliver a finished photograph of the world to consciousness. They provide the brain with a limited stream of data, and the brain assembles the most probable picture from it. Let us begin with color. Light has no redness or blueness in the sense in which we experience them. There is electromagnetic radiation with a particular spectral composition. Color arises after the signal is compared across different types of cone cells in the retina and processed by the visual system. That is why a shade cannot be identified reliably outside its surroundings. A gray patch on a dark background looks lighter than the same patch on a light background. Identical colored squares can seem different if the brain assumes that one lies in shadow. Moreover, different spectral combinations can sometimes produce the same sensation of color. This phenomenon is called metamerism. Physically, the light differs, but subjectively, the color matches. The reverse also works. When the lighting changes, the spectrum of light reflected from an object changes, yet a white sheet of paper usually remains white to us. The visual system takes the presumed light source into account and adjusts the result. This is color constancy. It is useful, but not infallible. If the context is deliberately arranged, the brain subtracts the illumination incorrectly, and people begin arguing about the color of the very same image. Now let us try a simple experiment. Close your left eye, use your right eye to look at one fixed point, and slowly move a small nearby object. At a certain position, it will disappear. It will not become blurred. It will literally drop out of perception. This is the blind spot, the part of the retina where the optic nerve leaves the eye and there are no photoreceptors. In everyday life, we do not notice an empty patch. The brain fills it with the most suitable background, using surrounding information and data from the other eye. It does not report, "There is no signal here." It quietly inserts the most likely version. This kind of editing happens constantly. During rapid eye movements, the image slides across the retina, yet the world does not look smeared. The visual system suppresses part of the information during saccades, the abrupt shifts of gaze. We make these movements several times a second, but subjectively we see a stable scene. Look at a stationary point long enough without moving your eyes, and objects in your peripheral vision may begin to fade or disappear. This is the Troxler effect. An unchanging signal gradually loses priority. The retina and later processing stages are especially sensitive not to constancy, but to change. Staring at a bright color for a long time produces a different result. Shift your gaze to a white surface, and an afterimage in the complementary color appears. Receptors and neural channels adapted to the previous stimulus, so the new neutral signal is processed unevenly. After watching a waterfall move, stationary rocks may seem to drift upward for a few seconds. Physically, they remain still. What changed was the calibration of the motion detectors. Continuous motion itself often exists only in perception. A film consists of separate frames. A sequence of still images shown at a suitable rate is combined into a single event. If two light sources flash alternately in different places at the right interval, an observer may see a single moving light. This is the phi phenomenon. The brain creates a trajectory that was never present in the physical signal. Something similar happens with sound. Doubling the physical power of an audio signal is not perceived as a simple doubling of loudness. The relationship between stimulus and sensation is nonlinear. Psychophysics studies this relationship. Hearing sensitivity also depends on frequency. Two tones with the same sound pressure level can seem unequally loud. Context interferes even more forcefully. If part of a familiar word is masked by noise, the brain often restores the missing sound, and the listener is certain they actually heard it. This is phonemic restoration. If you hear one syllable while watching a face pronounce another, a third perception can arise. This is the McGurk effect. Vision changes what we believe we heard. Expectation is also part of recognition itself. We read an unclear symbol among letters as a letter, and the same symbol among numbers as a digit. The same ambiguous image may be perceived first as a face and then as an object, but it is difficult to hold both versions at once. After a hint, a chaotic blot suddenly becomes a familiar figure, and afterward, it is almost impossible to stop seeing it. Even a physically identical signal does not guarantee an identical experience. People differ in the sensitivity of their cone cells. Color blindness changes the ability to distinguish certain shades. With age, the lens of the eye yellows and transmits less short-wavelength light. Previous experience affects the recognition of speech, faces, and musical intervals. A subtle difference may be informative to a specialist, while an untrained person does not notice it at all. We should not draw the convenient but false conclusion that perception is useless and everything around us is an illusion. In most everyday tasks, it works remarkably well. Yet it is not a direct recording of reality. It is a reconstruction, fast, economical, and based on probabilities and previous experience. This is where our confidence develops its first serious crack. We are accustomed to thinking that we see first and interpret afterward. In reality, interpretation begins before a finished picture reaches consciousness. Therefore, the phrase, "I saw it with my own eyes," confirms a person's sincerity, but does not guarantee the accuracy of their conclusion. Perception reconstructs the physical signal, but the brain's work does not end there. The events we see must still be connected, their frequency assessed, and a decision made about whether they are random or reflect a pattern. This is where the next problem arises. We usually do not calculate probability. We feel it. And our sense of probability is an unreliable tool. Imagine a room containing 23 people. What is the probability that at least 2 share a birthday? Intuitively, it seems low. After all, there are 365 days in a year. Yet, the probability of such a match already exceeds 50%. The reason is not anyone's special birthday. We are not comparing one person with everyone else. We are comparing all possible pairs. In a group of 23 people, there are 253 such pairs. With 70 people, the probability of at least one match exceeds 99%. The coincidence feels personal and rare, although at the group level it is almost inevitable. The same error occurs with any unusual event. Suppose the probability of a particular incident on one specific day is 1 in 1,000. That is indeed small. But if we observe 1,000 days, the chance of seeing it at least once can no longer be called negligible. And when thousands of people, devices, companies, or cities are observed at the same time, rare cases begin to appear regularly. The wording matters here. The probability of an event and the probability of at least one such event across many attempts are different things. In a sensational story, the number of attempts almost always disappears. We are shown one astonishing result and not told how many opportunities there were for it to occur. Let us toss a fair coin several times. The sequence heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails looks random. 6 heads in a row looks suspicious. Yet every particular sequence of 6 tosses has exactly the same probability. We simply perceive the first as disorder, while instantly noticing a structure in the second. If a coin is tossed for long enough, streaks are inevitable. In 100 tosses, several identical outcomes in a row do not prove that the coin is defective. On the contrary, a sequence with no noticeable runs would be too tidy. When people are asked to invent a random sequence, they usually alternate options too often and avoid repetition. True randomness looks more clustered than its human imitation. After 5 heads in a row, a strong feeling arises that tails is now due. This is the gambler's fallacy. If the tosses are independent, the coin does not remember previous results. The probability of another head remains the same. The streak may end or continue. The past does not create a debt that nature owes the observer. There is an opposite error as well. A person sees several successes in a row and decides that the performer is on a hot streak. Sometimes a run really does reflect a change in skill or conditions. Sometimes it is an ordinary fluctuation. One sequence is not enough to distinguish a lasting advantage from statistical noise. Regression to the mean is especially deceptive. A student performs unusually poorly, receives a stern lecture, and does better on the next assignment. It is very easy to decide that the sternness helped. But an extreme result often combines the person's usual level with a temporary influence, fatigue, luck, or a random error. At the next measurement, those factors may not recur, and the result may move closer to the average on its own. The same thing happens after an outstanding result. An athlete sets a personal record and then performs more weakly. This does not necessarily mean a loss of form or growing overconfidence. Extreme results rarely reflect a stable level completely. They usually include a share of favorable chance that is difficult to reproduce. Now imagine that someone dreams about an old acquaintance and receives a message from that person the next day. The coincidence is impressive, but the right question is tougher. How many dreams has the person had? How many acquaintances do they know? How many messages have arrived? And how many non-matches have they forgotten? Before the event, one had to predict a particular person, a particular action, and a particular time. After the event, we are free to fit a vague memory to the outcome we already know. Probability before an event and surprise after it must not be confused. Any precisely described sequence of everyday events is extremely unlikely in advance, yet some sequence has to occur. If in the morning you saw a red car, then heard an old song, and broke a cup in the evening, that exact combination was improbable. It simply does not seem meaningful because we never invented a story for it. A story appears when an outcome stands out emotionally. Newspapers report two people with identical names and remarkably similar biographies, but do not publish the millions of dissimilar biographies. A researcher can test many variables and find one effect by chance. If only that effect is reported and the other tests are not mentioned, a random finding looks like a discovery. That is why statistics accounts for multiple comparisons and requires the result to be confirmed again using new data. Selection also shapes stories of success. We see an entrepreneur who risked everything and became rich. Does that mean the risk was wise? No. The winner entered our field of view. People who took the same risk and lost everything rarely write books about their strategy. This is survivorship bias. The examples available to us do not represent the entire population. A lottery winner seems like an almost impossible person. For a specific participant, winning really is extremely unlikely. But if millions of tickets are sold, the appearance of some winner is no miracle. Advertising shows that person's face and hides the mass of losers, even though the losers are what determine the true probability. Large datasets operate like coincidence factories. Among millions of photographs, strikingly similar faces will be found. Among thousands of financial charts, patterns resembling famous events will appear. In a long sequence of numbers, dates, identifiers, and repetitions can be discovered. Finding a pattern proves nothing by itself. We need to know whether the criterion was specified in advance or chosen after the data had been examined. This is the boundary between a genuine pattern and a beautifully packaged coincidence. A real explanation does not merely fit what has already happened. It restricts possible outcomes in advance, survives repeated testing, and works on new observations. Everything else can look like design, especially when we are shown a successful hit and thousands of misses are carefully hidden. After discussing randomness, another trap emerges. Sometimes people argue about whether a certain event occurred when their real disagreement concerns something else. What name should be given to that event? We are accustomed to thinking that a word is simply attached to a finished object. Here is a forest, here is a mountain, here is an illness, here is an adult. But nature rarely draws boundaries so neatly. Where does a hill end and a mountain begin? There is no single worldwide threshold. Where does a stream become a river? Size, water flow, and local tradition give different answers. A coastline moves with the tide, and a river mouth may consist of many channels. Even the boundary between day and night is physically blurred by twilight, although a calendar requires an exact moment. A cloud seems like a separate object, yet it has no fixed surface. Droplets form and evaporate, and air passes through the visible structure. A flame has a shape and boundaries, but it is not a solid object. It is a rapidly changing zone of chemical reactions. A pile of sand remains a pile after one grain is removed. But if we continue, a moment comes when the word no longer fits, even though no individual grain created an obvious turning point. Food makes the problem even clearer. In botany, a tomato is a fruit. In cooking, it is a vegetable. In a legal context, its category may depend on rules governing trade and taxation. Peanuts are called nuts, although botanically they belong to the legumes. In everyday speech, a strawberry is a berry, but the botanical definition works differently. No one here has to be wrong. Different systems serve different purposes. The same applies to age. Biological maturation happens gradually. Legal adulthood begins on a specified day. The right to vote, buy alcohol, sign contracts, or operate a vehicle may begin at different ages. The word adult does not mean exactly the same thing in medicine, law, and family conversation. Medical boundaries are especially important to understand correctly. Blood pressure changes continuously, but guidelines use thresholds in order to make decisions. A 1,000th change in glucose level does not transform a healthy person into a sick one. A diagnostic boundary is a working criterion connected with risk, repeated measurements, and clinical context. It is not arbitrary, but neither is it an invisible wall inside the body. Even death has several working definitions. In everyday life, it usually means the irreversible loss of life. Clinical practice distinguishes cardiac arrest from brain death because modern equipment can temporarily maintain certain bodily functions. The more precise the task, the more precise the definition must be. New measurement methods change the categories themselves. Microscopy separated conditions that once looked identical. Genetic analysis revealed differences between outwardly similar organisms and kinship between dissimilar ones. Tomography made it possible to classify processes by internal structures unavailable to ordinary observation. Molecular diagnostics divides diseases by mechanism even when their symptoms overlap. This is not a weakness of science. Science is strong precisely because it declares its criteria in advance, tests their usefulness, and revises them when an old division stops working. The danger begins when a working label is mistaken for an eternal boundary in nature. That is why the question, "Are these really the same thing?" sometimes requires not a new fact, but a clarification of words. Who defines the category? For what purpose? According to which feature? Until those points are clear, an argument may sound substantive while remaining nothing more than a collision between different definitions. Now let us see how the same errors appear not in laboratory paradoxes, but in the most ordinary advice. Here, a misconception is rarely invented from beginning to end. It usually contains an observation that really works, accompanied by an explanation that has quietly become far too broad. People say that cold weather causes colds. A person can indeed become ill after getting chilled, but respiratory infections are caused by viruses, not by low temperature itself. Cold, dry air can affect the defenses of the mucous membranes, and in winter, people spend more time in enclosed spaces. So a connection exists, but the cause has been replaced by a condition that merely changes the risk of infection. By the same logic, antibiotics are sometimes treated as a powerful remedy for any infection. They act against bacteria, but do not cure ordinary viral illnesses. Improvement after several days can easily be attributed to the pills, even though the immune system may have defeated the virus on its own. This error is no longer harmless. Unnecessary antibiotic use promotes bacterial resistance and can cause side effects. A raised temperature is often treated as the illness itself and something that must be removed immediately. In reality, fever is a regulated response of the body to inflammation or infection. That does not mean it should always be endured. The temperature, how the person feels, their age, and any accompanying conditions all matter. But the logic that the lower the thermometer reading, the faster the recovery, is wrong. Fever-reducing medicine relieves symptoms. It does not destroy the cause of the illness. There is a persistent recommendation to drink a strictly defined number of glasses of water per day. Actual need depends on body mass, diet, air temperature, activity level, pregnancy, kidney function, and other factors. Some fluid comes from food, tea, and other drinks. The useful idea, avoid dehydration, has turned into a universal rule that does not exist in that form. Sweating, in turn, is called a way to remove toxins. Its primary purpose is to cool the body. The liver, kidneys, lungs, and intestines do most of the work of neutralizing and removing substances. Some compounds can indeed be detected in sweat, but this does not mean that increased sweating cleanses the body. After a sauna, what has mainly decreased is the amount of water, not mysterious accumulated poisons. In the kitchen, people confidently repeat that searing meat seals in the juices. The crust really does create flavor and aroma through reactions between amino acids and sugars. but it does not form an airtight shell, and moisture continues to escape. The result is real. The explanation was invented afterward. Salt is said to make water boil faster. Dissolved salt raises the boiling point, but the amount used in cooking changes it only slightly. With the same heat input, the wait may even become a little longer. Salt is added for flavor and for its effects on the food, not as an efficient way to speed up boiling. Microwave ovens are said to heat food from the inside out. In reality, microwaves penetrate food only to a limited depth and generate heat within the volume they can reach. The energy then spreads farther by thermal conduction. That is why a thick portion can remain cold in the center, and why the temperature may be distributed unevenly. The observation that a microwave works differently from a frying pan is correct. The everyday explanation is not. A fan is called a device that cools a room. Left running in an empty room, it does not lower the temperature, and even adds a small amount of heat from its motor. It is the person who feels cooler. Moving air increases heat transfer and the evaporation of sweat. We feel the effect on our skin and mistakenly extend it to all the air in the room. The same substitution occurs in technology. The strength of a wireless network signal is not the same as internet speed. A strong signal indicates the quality of the connection to the access point, but bandwidth also depends on interference, network load, equipment, and the provider's connection. Full bars on the screen do not promise a fast download. Incognito mode is also often mistaken for anonymity mode. Its main purpose is to avoid saving local history and some session data on the device. Websites, the internet provider, or the administrator of a workplace network may still see the relevant activity. The name sounds broader than the actual function, so users credit the tool with protection it does not provide. Camera advertising long relied on a simple rule. More megapixels means a better photograph. Pixel count really does affect detail, especially with good lighting and high-quality optics. But the result also depends on sensor size, the lens, noise, dynamic range, and processing. One convenient measurement was presented as the quality of the entire system. A common battery recommendation says that a device should always be discharged completely to avoid the memory effect. This was more relevant to certain older nickel-cadmium cells. Modern lithium-ion batteries work differently, and regular deep discharging usually does not benefit them. The old rule outlived the technology for which it was created. Motor oil has a similar history. Universal advice to change it after one short, fixed mileage interval arose with different engines, oils, and operating conditions. Today, the interval is specified by the manufacturer of the particular vehicle, and severe conditions may shorten it. A technical maintenance schedule cannot be replaced by family folklore. Fuel with a higher octane rating is often advertised as more powerful. The octane number indicates resistance to engine knock, not the amount of energy in each liter. An engine designed for such fuel needs it, or can use it to achieve its intended settings. But, in an engine that runs properly on regular gasoline, the more expensive fuel does not necessarily produce a noticeable increase in power. Even percentages can create everyday illusions. If risk falls from 2 cases per 1,000 to 1, the relative reduction is 50%. The absolute reduction is 1 case per 1,000. Both statements are mathematically correct, but they create different impressions. Advertising chooses the more dramatic number and often leaves the original risk out of the picture. Finally, the word natural is treated as a synonym for safe. But the origin of a substance does not determine its toxicity. Nature contains some of the strongest poisons, while a synthetic compound may be thoroughly studied and safe at an established dose. The phrase chemical-free has no strict meaning at all. All food, air, and the human body consist of chemicals. This is how most persistent everyday misconceptions work. First, a real effect is noticed. Then, a simple explanation is chosen. Next, conditions, limitations, and exceptions are removed, leaving a rule that is easy to repeat but dangerous to apply thoughtlessly. That is why we must check not only the fact itself, we must ask what causes it, where it works, and at what point it stops being true. After everyday misconceptions, it is useful to look at the hidden side of the familiar world. Many things seem simple, not because nothing is happening inside them, but because an engineer has already hidden the complexity from the user. Good design does not demand constant attention. It maintains the operating state, distributes load, corrects some errors, and stops before a mistake becomes an accident. An ordinary thermostat does not maintain temperature through one continuous, precisely controlled effort. It switches the heating on when it becomes too cold and turns it off when the upper limit is reached. A small interval is left between those points, hysteresis. Without it, the device would switch too frequently and wear out faster. Similar self-regulation works in a toilet cistern. A float follows the water level and closes the supply through a valve. In an electric kettle, steam reaches a heat-sensitive mechanism that opens the circuit. If there is no water, separate overheat protection should switch off the heating element. One mechanism controls normal operation, while another guards against failure. This is redundancy. A pressure cooker does not rely on a single component either. The operating valve regulates pressure, while an additional element is intended to handle a dangerous excess. The sealed lid is mechanically locked so that it cannot simply be opened while under pressure. Safety here is created not by a strong pot alone, but by a sequence of independent restrictions. Now consider load distribution. A thin sheet of cardboard bends easily, but after corrugation it becomes much stiffer. The wavy inner layer holds the flat outer layers apart, and the whole panel resists bending more effectively. That is why a shipping box can carry a load while using relatively little material. An egg carton works differently, but uses the same principle. Its raised sections separate fragile objects, limit movement, and transfer an external force to many supports. Ribs on a plastic bottle are not there merely for appearance. They increase the stiffness of its thin wall. A concave base helps the container keep its shape and remain stable under internal pressure. The aluminum can is especially revealing. Its cylindrical wall handles uniform internal pressure well. The top is made narrower than the body because the lid requires thicker, more expensive metal. A small reduction in diameter saves material across millions of products. A simple shape turns out to be the result of calculations involving load and cost. A bicycle wheel supports a person not through thick spokes acting like columns. Properly tensioned spokes mainly work in tension. The load changes their tension, while the rim distributes force among several components. That is why a light structure can support a load that appears out of proportion to its mass. Feedback is hidden in modern brakes as well. An anti-lock braking system monitors wheel rotation. If one wheel begins to lock, pressure in the brake circuit is briefly reduced and then increased again. The system does not simply brake harder. It repeatedly adjusts its action according to measured results, preserving control of the vehicle. Active noise-canceling headphones use external sound against itself. A microphone measures low-frequency noise, electronics generate a signal in the opposite phase, and the sound waves partially cancel each other. Complete silence does not result. Unpredictable and high-frequency sounds are more difficult to suppress. The device defeats interference not with brute force insulation, but with controlled interference. Electronic scales do not directly feel anything either. The load slightly deforms an elastic element, and a strain gauge changes its electrical resistance. The signal is amplified, converted, and only then becomes a number on the display. Even a steady zero is the result of calibration, not the absence of measurement error. Measurement error cannot be removed completely. It can only be managed. Parts are manufactured with tolerances, permitted deviations from the nominal size. A shaft and a hole do not need to be mathematically perfect. their actual dimensions need to provide the required fit. Too little clearance causes friction and jamming, while too much causes play and vibration. In manufacturing, not every part is measured with a complex instrument. A go/no-go gauge quickly answers a practical question: does the size pass or not? A bottle cap is tightened to a controlled torque. Too little torque causes leakage. Too much damages the thread or seal. Quality often lies not at one perfect point, but within a properly chosen range. Standardization performs invisible work even before assembly. A standardized thread allows a screw to be replaced without manufacturing a special matching pair. Standard paper sizes are designed so that when a sheet is divided in half, the proportions of its sides remain the same. This allows a document to be reduced or enlarged without changing the layout. A barcode contains more than product data. It includes service elements used to determine the direction of scanning and a check digit that helps detect an error. A QR code goes farther. Redundant information makes it possible to recover data even if part of the image is damaged or covered. Visually, these fragments seem unnecessary. From an engineering perspective, they are a safety margin against the real world. Redundancy also exists in digital communication. Check bits are added to transmitted data so the receiver can detect and sometimes correct distortion. Resending a packet is not considered a system failure. It is built into the protocol. Reliability is created not by the absence of errors, but by the ability to detect and handle them. A material is often told in advance where it should break. A notch in packaging concentrates stress and defines the tear line. Perforation weakens a selected area while leaving the rest intact. An electrical fuse does the same thing. A thin element melts before the wiring has time to overheat dangerously. A deliberately weak point protects a more valuable system. Some devices use not direct force, but a secondary physical effect. A piezoelectric element in a lighter produces high voltage and a spark when struck. An induction cooktop generates an alternating magnetic field that induces currents directly in suitable cookware. A refrigerator transfers heat through the evaporation and condensation of refrigerant. Cooling inside is part of a closed process, while excess heat is released outside. That is why the simplicity of a familiar object is deceptive. Behind one press of a button may stand feedback, allowable deviations, error control, and a backup layer of protection. We do not notice this engineering precisely because it works. A poorly designed object constantly demands attention. A well-designed one accounts in advance for the facts that materials deform, measurements are imperfect, signals become distorted, and sooner or later a person will inevitably do the wrong thing. So far, we have examined individual errors, the wrong scale, a random coincidence, an imprecise definition, and oversimplified everyday causality. But the most serious error appears when a person understands the individual parts correctly and still predicts the behavior of the whole incorrectly. Consider traffic flow. While there are few cars, each additional vehicle has almost no effect on movement. Then, density reaches a threshold. One driver needs only to brake slightly, the next presses the pedal harder, a third reacts with a delay, and a wave of stopping travels backward along the road. There may be no accident ahead. The traffic jam arises as a collective effect that is not present in any single car. A threshold fundamentally changes the result. One grain of sand does almost nothing to a stable slope, but after material accumulates, the next grain may trigger a slide. One infected person rarely creates a large outbreak, but with enough contacts, transmission begins to sustain itself. A small influence becomes decisive not because of its own strength, but because the system has already approached the boundary of stability. This is how cascades begin. In an electrical grid, the shutdown of one overloaded line redirects current to neighboring lines. If they have spare capacity, the system survives. If the reserve is small, the new load knocks out the next component, and then another. The initial fault may be local, while the outcome is widespread. The cause cannot be understood by examining only the first failure. The structure of the connections matters. Connections can be reinforcing. A microphone picks up sound from a speaker, amplifies it. The speaker reproduces the amplified signal, and the cycle repeats. A sharp squeal appears. This is positive feedback. The output of the process returns to the input and increases the original deviation. A similar mechanism works without wires or amplifiers. A rumor of a shortage makes people buy up a product. Emptying shelves confirm the rumor, purchasing accelerates, and a shortage that may not have existed at first becomes real. Fear causes action, and action creates evidence for the fear. Looking only at the initial inventory is pointless here. The participant's behavior has already become part of the system. Negative feedback works in the opposite way. It reduces deviation. A vehicle's cruise control system compares the set speed with the actual speed and changes engine output. It adds power uphill and reduces it downhill. A constant result is created not by stillness, but by a continuous series of small corrections. That is why a stable state often looks motionless, only from the outside. A market price, equipment temperature, an unmanned aircraft's position, or the quality of a production process is maintained through many corrections. Stop the corrective loop, and a system that seemed naturally stable will begin moving away from the norm. But feedback becomes dangerous when it is delayed. Imagine a shower in which hot water does not arrive immediately. A person turns the tap, feels no change, and turns it farther. Then water that is too hot arrives, the tap is quickly turned back, and oscillations begin. The problem is not weak control, but a response that lags behind the decision. In supply chains, a small increase in customer demand can cause much larger fluctuations in orders placed with suppliers. A store orders extra stock. The warehouse interprets the increase as permanent. The manufacturer raises output, and by the time actual demand levels off, the system is already overfilled. This is called the bullwhip effect. A moderate movement at one end turns into a wide swing at the other. Delay also makes the true cause difficult to see. A decision is made today, inventory runs low a week later, production changes after a month, and the consequences are assessed even later. By then, attention has already shifted to another event. A person searches for the nearest cause, even though the real one was separated from the outcome by a long chain. Complex systems can synchronize. Metronomes placed on a shared movable platform may gradually begin swinging in the same rhythm. Each sends weak impulses through the base. The platform affects the others, and small adjustments accumulate. There is no separate conductor. The connection creates the common rhythm. In a similar way, generators in a power grid must operate in agreement in frequency and phase. A group of people on a bridge may unconsciously adjust their steps to the structure's oscillations, while the oscillations strengthen the synchronization of those steps. That is why an engineer evaluates not only the weight of a crowd, but also the possibility of rhythmic interaction. The same load produces different consequences when applied randomly and when applied in unison. A network introduces another property. The value of an individual element depends on the number of connections. One telephone is useless. Two create one line of communication. As the number of participants grows, the number of possible connections increases much faster than the number of devices themselves. That is why some technologies seem unnecessary for a long time, and then spread rapidly after reaching critical mass. More connections, however, are not always better. A dense network transmits information faster and simultaneously spreads errors, malware, or panic faster. High connectivity improves efficiency under normal conditions, but it can accelerate a cascade during a failure. A property that helps the system every day becomes a channel of destruction under unusual conditions. It is especially dangerous to improve one section without considering the whole. Widening a short stretch of road speeds up entry, but may overload a bottleneck farther ahead even more. Adding a new road can sometimes increase total travel time. Drivers choose their routes independently, and individually advantageous choices create a collectively worse result. This is known as Brace's paradox. In manufacturing, maximizing the use of every machine seems rational, but if there is no reserve between stages, a small delay is transmitted immediately down the line. Queues grow, urgent orders interfere with ordinary ones, and throughput time increases. The local efficiency of each section reduces the efficiency of the entire line. Reserve capacity is often mistaken for waste. Spare power, an additional supplier, a backup component, or a time buffer seems unnecessary while everything is working normally. But a fully optimized system may lose the ability to absorb a surprise. When we remove redundancy, we often remove resilience. A single powerful blow is not always more dangerous than a weak series. A material may withstand one large load, but fail after many smaller cycles because of fatigue. An organization may survive one crisis by using its reserves, yet several moderate disruptions in succession can exhaust its people, supplies, and time. Recovery is needed between blows. Without it, every new impact begins from an already weakened state. Here is the central conclusion. The behavior of a complex system is determined not by the sum of its parts, but by connections, delays, thresholds, and feedback loops. That is why the question, which component caused everything, is often too simplistic. Sometimes the decisive component is not the strongest one, but the one that acted at the right point, at a dangerous moment, and triggered a process that reinforced itself. After discussing complex systems, a natural question arises. How can their state be described at all? Usually we turn to numbers. That is reasonable. But a number alone does not protect us from error. In fact, an exact-looking figure often gives a weak conclusion more authority than it deserves. Imagine a small company where 9 employees each receive a notional $1,000, while the manager receives $20,000. The average payment will be almost $3,000. Formally, this is correct, yet most employees never see that amount. The median, the value in the middle of an ordered series, will be closer to 1,000 and will describe the typical employee far more accurately. The mean is especially sensitive to rare extreme values. One unusually expensive house can noticeably raise the average price in a neighborhood. The median changes less. But the median is not universal either. If we need to calculate total spending, the mean may be more useful. The question is not which measure is honest. The question is whether it fits the task. Now consider percentages. Sales increased from 2 items to 4, a rise of 100%. It sounds impressive, although the absolute increase is only 2 units. If a measure grows from 50,000 to 51,000, the relative increase is only 2%, but the real increase is 1,000. One presentation magnifies the impression, while the other weakens it. Both can be mathematically flawless. The phrase, risk fell by 1/3, also says nothing without the starting level. A decrease from 3 cases per million to 2 is 1/3 relative to the previous value, but only 1 prevented case per million in absolute terms. A medical decision requires both quantities, along with side effects, the duration of observation, and patient characteristics. One dramatic percentage cannot replace the clinical picture. Unnecessary precision also creates false confidence. If household scales measure mass with an error of tens of grams, the result cannot meaningfully be recorded to the nearest thousandth of a gram. If survey participants' ages are known only in whole years, an average such as 42.731 does not make the study more precise. The number of decimal places should reflect measurement quality, not the capabilities of a calculator. The result also changes with the boundaries of the sample. Average travel speed will be one value if only movement is counted, and another if stops are included. A store's income looks different over a holiday week, an ordinary month, and a full year. A treatment's success rate changes if patients who withdrew because of side effects are excluded. An invisible question always stands before a number. Who, what, and which period were included in the calculation? Small samples produce especially sharp results. In a group of 4 people, one case immediately represents a quarter of all observations. In a group of 1,000, one case changes almost nothing. That is why a small school may randomly show either the best or the worst pass rate, even when the quality of teaching is ordinary. An extreme result does not necessarily imply an extreme cause. Selection after the event distorts the picture even more. If we study only businesses that survived a crisis, we may mistake the characteristics of survivors for a recipe for rescue. But companies that closed may have had the same characteristics. If we survey only clients who completed a program, the resulting satisfaction rate tells us nothing about those who left. Missing observations can be more important than the ones present. Correlation makes a number more persuasive, but it does not establish a cause. Ice cream sales and the number of sunburn cases rise together not because one causes the other. Both depend on heat and sunny weather. 2 measures can move together because of a third factor, reverse influence, or ordinary coincidence. A correlation coefficient describes joint change, but the mechanism must be demonstrated separately. Sometimes an overall measure even hides the direction of the relationship inside separate groups. One treatment method may show better results among patients with mild conditions and separately among patients with severe conditions, yet lose in the combined statistics if the methods were applied to groups with different compositions. This is Simpson's paradox. It reminds us that reducing heterogeneous data to one number can do more than weaken a conclusion. It can reverse it. A measure behaves even more strangely when it becomes a target. If a school is judged only by test results, it may learn to raise scores without improving deep understanding. If a support service is told to shorten call duration, employees are encouraged to end conversations faster, not necessarily to solve problems. This is called Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. One phenomenon often allows several honest methods of calculation. Unemployment can be estimated from registered claims or from population surveys, producing different coverage. A device's reliability can be described by its failure rate, its mean time to failure, or its probability of operating for a specified period. None of these figures has to be false. They simply answer different questions. Time series charts require special caution. If a line begins immediately before a sharp rise, the result looks like a success story. If an earlier starting point is chosen, the same rise may turn out to be merely a recovery after a fall. A short interval emphasizes fluctuation. A long one reveals a trend. And a vertical axis truncated near the observed values visually turns a small difference into a cliff. A ranking completes the illusion. First and 10th place appear far apart, even though the actual scores may differ by fractions of a percent and fall within the margin of error. With different weights assigned to the criteria, the order will change. A position number by itself shows neither the size of the difference nor the stability of the result. Therefore, a persuasive number must be checked not for beauty and not only for arithmetic correctness. We must reconstruct its origin. What was measured, with what uncertainty, who was excluded, what it was compared with, and why this particular measure was chosen. A number can be precise. The impression it creates can still be false. Now we have everything we need to return to the question with which this episode began. How can we distinguish a genuinely amazing fact from an error that merely sounds good? There is no universal detector, but there is a sequence of checks that sharply reduces the probability of self-deception. First, reconstruct the precise wording. Not, "Sharks existed before trees," but "The earliest known shark-like fish appeared before the first known trees." Not, "A banana is a berry and a strawberry is not," but By botanical criteria, a banana is classified as a berry, while a strawberry forms a different type of fruit. Clarification removes the dramatic extra meaning, but preserves the real paradox. Pay special attention to the words always, never, any, and impossible. The claim, honey never spoils, is too broad. It is more accurate to say that mature honey with low moisture, stored under suitable conditions, is extremely resistant to spoilage. Add water, contamination, or improper conditions, and the universality disappears. Sometimes, one limitation is all that separates a fact from a myth. Next, check the scale and the units. 1 millimeter of rainfall is a layer of water, not one tiny drop across the entire area. The temperature of lightning is higher than the temperature of the sun's surface, but a lightning channel is extremely narrow and exists for a very short time. A high temperature does not mean a larger total store of energy. One number cannot be compared without considering the object's size and the process's duration. Find the original value. Risk doubled may mean an increase from 1 case per million to 2. Effectiveness increased by 50% may mean a rise from 2% to 3. The relative change is formally correct, but the absolute difference reveals the practical meaning. If the comparison baseline is hidden, a strong conclusion is not yet justified. After that, separate the observation from the explanation. Meat really does develop a crust after searing, but the crust does not seal in moisture. People suffer respiratory infections more often during the cold season, but the infection is caused by a pathogen, not by low temperature itself. A microphone begins squealing near a speaker, but the source of the effect is not sound that is too loud. It is a closed, positive feedback loop. The observation may be accurate while the causal story is wrong. Ask how many attempts there were. Matching birthdays in a large group cease to be miraculous because many pairs are being compared. A single lottery winner looks impossible, while millions of tickets remain outside the frame. A successful prediction seems impressive only when dozens of failed ones are hidden. The more opportunities there were for a coincidence, the more cautiously we should evaluate the pattern we found. The size and composition of a sample are no less important. 3 successful cases do not establish a general rule. Reviews from satisfied clients do not describe those who abandoned the service. Average income may be raised by a few extremely large values. A study's result can change if participants who stopped treatment because of adverse effects disappear from the data. We must look not only for the data that were collected, but also for the people who never entered them. Sometimes verification depends not on measurement, but on definition. A tomato is simultaneously a botanical fruit and a culinary vegetable. Adulthood has a legal boundary, even though biological maturation is gradual. A mountain, island, forest, or city may be classified by different criteria. Before deciding who is right, determine whether the parties are using the word in the same sense. Then find the conditions under which the claim applies. A fan cools a person through moving air, but it does not necessarily cool an empty closed room. High-octane fuel is useful in an engine designed for the corresponding operating mode, but it does not make every engine more powerful. Advice may be reasonable under certain conditions and false after being transferred to another system. Finally, try to imagine what could disprove the claim. If every event is declared a confirmation, the explanation is not testable. A reliable hypothesis risks being wrong. It specifies the expected outcome in advance, allows measurement, and survives repetition on new data. A beautiful story explains everything after the event. A good explanation limits what is possible before it. This kind of checking does not make the world more boring. On the contrary, it restores weight to our sense of wonder. An unverified sensation lasts only until the first serious correction. A reliable paradox becomes even more interesting after clarification because we now understand exactly where familiar intuition failed. The goal is not to stop believing the incredible. The goal is to learn to be amazed by what truly exists. Every reliable fact has boundaries, not because truth is relative and everyone may choose a convenient version, but because a statement always applies to particular conditions, measurements, and objects. Remove those limitations, and an accurate conclusion turns into an exaggeration. A laboratory experiment shows what happens at a controlled temperature, a specified concentration, and a chosen duration of exposure. In an ordinary environment, dozens of factors change at the same time. A result in a cell culture does not automatically become a result for a whole organism. Success in animal models does not yet prove effectiveness in humans, and an average effect in a study does not predict the fate of every patient. A statistical pattern describes probabilities within a group. An individual may fall far from the average without disproving the overall trend. Conversely, one vivid case does not cancel the data from a large sample. An exception requires an explanation, but it does not gain the right to rewrite the rule single-handedly. A model must not be confused with reality itself. A weather map simplifies the atmosphere. An economic forecast simplifies the behavior of millions of participants. And a computer simulation contains only the relationships built into it. A useful model does not have to reproduce everything. It must answer a particular question well enough. Outside that task, its accuracy may disappear sharply. It is especially important to distinguish "we do not know" from "this is impossible." An unknown mechanism does not become supernatural simply because an explanation has not yet been found. But a lack of confirmation does not prove that a phenomenon definitely does not exist either. A stricter principle applies. The absence of evidence becomes an argument only when that evidence should have been detected if the phenomenon existed. One observation may allow several explanations. An unusual signal may be a new effect, an instrument malfunction, sample contamination, or an error in data processing. That is why a preliminary result is checked by an independent method, repeated on other samples, and compared with alternative hypotheses. The word preliminary is not a formality. It indicates the true degree of confidence. Sometimes repeated testing confirms a discovery. Sometimes it reduces the size of the effect. Sometimes it shows that the result depended on narrow conditions. At times, the conclusion must be rejected completely. This is not a sign that science has failed. Failure would mean preserving the old claim after the data no longer support it. A fact ends where its evidence ends. Beyond that point, a reasonable hypothesis, a cautious assumption, or a beautiful story may begin, but they can no longer be called established knowledge. And perhaps this is exactly what preserves genuine wonder. A sensation needs only allowed formulation. A real phenomenon must withstand measurement, doubt, repetition, and an attempt to disprove it. If it remains a fact after all of that, it needs no exaggeration. Even without exaggeration, the world turns out to be more complex, stranger, and far more interesting than any fiction. Thank you for spending this time with me. I look forward to welcoming you back to my channel. Sweet dreams.